If you've ever watched like a recovery meeting on TV, it's like 6 sad people in a church basement and they like chant your name at you. And so you're always like, I don't think I want to go to that. That doesn't sound exciting. Laughter is such a huge part of it. And that's not reflected in pop culture when you see recovery.
Sean Daniels is the hilarious, warm, and honest writer behind the hugely successful play, The White Chip, a comedy about addiction. Since its debut in 2019, The White Chip has had rave reviews, sold out shows in New York, and pulled in big producing partners like Hank Azaria, Jason Biggs, and John Larroquette. But the play is just one of Sean's projects that is using the arts to change the national narrative around addiction and save lives in the process.
When I was trying to get sober, I couldn't find anything that didn't have like 1920s language or had a sense of humor. And so I guess I at some point was like, well, then I have to write the thing that I can't find.
May is Mental Health Awareness Month. So this month's episodes of The Breakout are devoted to breaking out of addiction. Today, Sean shares how he's using comedy and science to shift the conversation around substance abuse. He also explains that when it comes to building a united front against addiction, a lot can be learned from the humble peanut.
Welcome to The Breakout, a show about smashing through life's little boxes and forging your own path. I'm Dr. Carrie Ulrich.
And I'm Kelly Gunther. Carrie and I are people and change experts and best friends. We've spent more than 25 years helping organizations navigate change and get the best out of their people.
Come on, we know change is hard, but staying the same can even be harder. On The Breakout, we prove that you can escape expectations, and best of all, we show you how. Sean, why don't you start with, in a couple of sentences, tell us what you broke out of and what you're helping others break out of.
What did I break out of? I was a really great alcoholic for a long time. I was really, I feel like, top of my game. But it got to the point I had crashed my car. I had been fired from my job. My wife had left me, and I was really suicidal. I mean, I was really at the end of it. It had been months since somebody had smiled to see me coming. And so I really wanted to end it all. And oddly enough, I was going to take my life, but instead of doing it, I called my mother. I didn't actually get along with my mother, so I don't know why I called her at that moment. And very oddly enough, for whatever you believe in, it was the 1-year anniversary of her getting sober. She had been sober for 1 year on that day. And so she took the call and she got me through that evening, got me on a plane, got me into a rehab center. And that was 12 and a half years ago. And so I've been incredibly lucky to be able to have some great career heights working in the performing arts since then, but also to be able to do this work about trying to use the arts to battle addiction, which I feel like is the main key going forward.
Thank you for sharing that story already, and congratulations on being sober for 12 and a half years. I appreciate the way you introduced yourself. I can already tell your humor. Like, well, I was top of my game.
Well, you know, it's so funny. So I wrote a play that is a comedy about addiction, and everyone's always like, why would you write a comedy that, and you know, because I don't know anything that's not funny. I don't know a world that doesn't have humor. I mean, even you go to the world's worst funerals and everybody's just waiting for somebody to say something dumb so that they can all laugh and get that first laugh out of the way. So I also grew up in the 80s, which meant that I got to watch a lot of after-school specials, like very special episodes.
Very special episodes.
That's right.
Yeah.
And, you know, Tom Hanks is drunk, and that's how you know that alcohol is a bad thing. And what those things did was make you feel like it only happened to certain people. And when it happened to them, it was a very precious, lightly underscored event that people would get through. And so that's not the way it is, right? It affects 1 in 3 households in our country. So it's everybody. But I think unless you talk about it with a sense of humor, I feel like that's why we're missing the conversation. I feel like that's why sometimes we're not talking about what's actually going on in our country.
You're so right. If you can't find humor. This is serious topics, but to help people get through it, even Kelly and I on talking about self-awareness, and we do assessments with people. We always try to bring in some humor because they're heavy topics. Like heaviness you can deal with for a little bit, but there's got to be a little bit of humor to get you through it.
Yeah, I feel like I've given enough medicine to cats and dogs to realize that the best way to get them to do it is to wrap it in something else.
Yes.
That they don't. If you just try to talk them into it, it really never seems to work. But, hidden in a little something that they're excited to get makes a big difference.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. The play, which is called The White Chip, and it's been such a success. So why don't you just tell me more about that and the events that inspired it?
Yeah, so, when I was trying to get sober, I couldn't find anything that didn't have like 1920s language or had a sense of humor or was about science. Because for me, what really did it was I found a group of men in Jacksonville, Florida, who were obsessed with the science of addiction that they had studied. And so they sat me down and they wanted me to learn about neural pathways and dopamine regulation and brain plasticity. And so like all these things that I had been struggling for years to try to get sober, and no one had ever explained to me what this was. It was declared a disease in the 50s. The CDC declared it an emergency in 2011, but somehow we don't talk about the science of addiction at all. And so for the first time ever for me, it wasn't about kind of shame and weakness, that it was about like genetic predisposition. Genetics makes up 40 to 60% of whether somebody's going to become addicted to something. I say that like we're an Irish family with a drinking problem and everybody laughs. So it's like on some level, you actually already understand the way that like generational addiction gets passed down and predisposition. And so you already like understand what it is, but we don't make the leap to then be like, oh, well, then why don't we treat it like other diseases where we know that certain people are predisposed to be able to have it. And so there was nothing like that. And so I guess I at some point was like, well, then I have to write the thing that I can't find. And I'd worked in theater my whole life, so it felt like a play was kind of an easy place to start. And I was very lucky. We just had an off-Broadway run, and Hank Azaria and John Larroquette and Jason Biggs, Annalee Ashford, they came on as producers of the show. And we had high-profile people, Edie Falco attending. The Clinton Foundation came and did a whole evening, and Chelsea Clinton spoke afterwards. So it really kind of took on its own life. And then we'll kind of see what happens afterwards. But it was a real honor. I will tell you, one of the cool things that happened after every performance, every single one, somebody would come up and say like, okay, I'm ready to get help now. And our actors were like delightful people, but they were like they're not medical professionals. They're like unprepared for somebody to confess to them that It's time for them to get services. So I love my producers for this. They put together resources on, like 12 QR codes that were right up front that said, like, if you want to get help and if you're LGBT, here's an organization for you to talk to. And if you're suicidal, here's one, so that you could get it afterwards. But it was a fascinating endeavor that after every single one, somebody would come and ask for help immediately afterwards.
We'll get back to the interview after this quick break.
The Breakout comes to you from a Abrachi Group. We offer coaching and consulting to help you dig into change. Here's what we know. Only about 10% of us are really self-aware. Without self-awareness, improvement is tough, because if you don't know what box you're in, you can't break out of it. That's where we come in.
We've got a soft spot for people itching to forge a fresh path, the high flyers who need to be nudged out of career ruts, teams who are looking to become more aligned, and yes, even those bold souls who've occasionally worn the jerk badge. Connect with us at abrachigroup.com. You mentioned that you were talking with all these folks in Jacksonville about the brain science behind addiction. What was something, Sean, that really changed your mindset? You just went, oh my God, no wonder.
There's a thing that your brain does that's called euphoric recall. So your brain always wants dopamine. Your brain like loves dopamine, right? And so when you're an addict, your brain is watching you take in whatever it is. And so your brain's trying to maintain balance, right? So your brain will lower the levels of dopamine that it has because it's watching you take things that are jacking up the levels of dopamine coming in, right? Your brain thinks it's helping, which is why every addict, when they quit, feels just terrible for like the first 90 days because your brain doesn't believe you that you're really quitting. So your brain continues to do it. And then after about 90 days, your brain says like, I guess you really did quit. And then it releases all this dopamine into you. And then, at 90 days, suddenly everyone has this thing they call the pink cloud where it's like, suddenly trees are brighter and they feel better. And a lot of people equate it to a religious experience. And these gentlemen were like, it may be God, but it's definitely science. That is definitely after 90 days, your brain saying like, okay, I believe you. And then your brain does this thing called euphoric recall. And I love it because the people that it affects the most are addicts and women thinking about having a second child. Because what it does is that it takes experiences in your life and it helps you to remember just the parts that gave you a dopamine high, right? Like if you really could remember what it was, like nobody would ever have a second child and nobody who went
100%.
on, who had a relapse would ever go back, right? But somehow your brain says like, well, it was tough, but think of how great it is. You know what I mean? Like your brain wants you to be able to go do things that get more dopamine. And so for me, it was just such a shocking way of thinking about it because I had just felt bad and I had felt shameful, and to think about it as a disease really helped me to be able to wrap my head around it. And even to this day, I say that, they say you have to have a higher power to get sober. So my higher power is science, that I think a lot of times about what's bigger than me.
Just to know that those 90 days are so difficult that you're literally working against your brain, what your brain wants you to do. That must give you some piece of like, it's so much a part of this brain wiring. And really, my brain is kind of an asshole right now for 90 days.
Yeah. I mean, listen, I don't know what's going on with my brain because, I've been sober for now 12 and a half years. And even every now and then my brain will be like, I don't know. What do you think? Do you? And you're just like, what are you? Where does that come from? Why is that still an idea somewhere in there? You have to be vigilant.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. What you're talking about is that back in the days of the special TV shows, it was also just say no. Our narrative was so much, you can just say no and it's fine. That's all you have to do. And I love what you're doing is telling people that's part of it, but it's also your brain, the environment, how we talk about it, and you're really opening up that whole discussion. So what else can we get right, Sean, about the discussion about addiction and recovery?
I think a lot about peanuts, and I think about how, we have like solved the scourge of peanuts in the last 5 years, right? Like if you have a peanut allergy, like Delta will pull every peanut off that plane. And I went to a theater conference this last year. They just announced from the beginning, there's no peanuts at this conference. And you were like, oh, wow. Okay. So we can do it. Like we are able to change narratives drastically, right? But deep down inside, like we don't believe that having a peanut allergy is a moral failing. Right. And so that's the difference there. And, it's interesting even about cancer. We used to believe that having cancer was a moral failing, and that has gone away. That has changed in our lifetime, that now, even if you smoke and you get cancer, we will still be there for you. Friends will still run marathons for you. We're able to tackle disease in a very kind of community positive way. And with addiction, we don't, to even admit that you have a problem is an issue to admit to other people. And then this is like a little controversial, but the idea that like everybody who has struggled with substance use conditions needs to be anonymous and not talk about it, I feel like only adds to the perception that like nobody's out there. So like once you say 1 in 3 households, everyone's like, I'm sorry, what? Like there's four, right? There's four people on this podcast right now, which means that like 1.2 of us, right, is affected by it.
Yep.
And I guess it's
Yep.
me, but I'm just saying that like any group of people you get together is that. And so if it was anything else, we would be talking about it more. And that stops people from getting the help they need.
Well, I could listen to him for hours. I mean, just his wisdom and his humor. Like, he's so approachable, so engaging, so warm.
Yeah, I loved his blend of science and story. I mean, he spoke our language, Kelly. There's science, there's humor, there's self-actualization, there's vulnerability. I mean, he hit on every single thing that you and I love so much. And Kelly, you and I talk about all the time the power of storytelling, and that's what changes things. I'm a big believer that soap operas have helped because they brought stories about AIDS, about drug addiction, about gay marriage far before other TV shows. So it's so powerful to bring in stories.
I mean, I think comedy and laughing is just a nice equalizer. It's something that does lighten the mood. And so when you can do it in a way that isn't disrespectful to the population in which you're looking to share, it can be such a powerful way to show that this isn't the end of the world, that there's another path out there.
What do you think about, like, we don't have like peanut parties. Do you know what I mean? Like, we don't have commercials that show like how much fun it is to eat peanuts. And yet every commercial in the Super Bowl shows like how amazing it is to drink and have fun. And so how hard do you think it is to crack that kind of environment in society telling us like, this is the most fun you're going to have? How do you come to terms with all that?
Yeah, so part of what we want to do at Live Tampa Bay and the Recovery Project, we're really trying to use the arts to change national narratives about what it is, right? Because that's a national narrative that like you will drink beer and like models will come and hang out with you while you do so, right? And it's just never how it worked for me, but I appreciate the idea. So during the pandemic, there were all these studies on national narratives, and they studied gay marriage, right? Which is to say that when Barack Obama ran for president, he was against gay marriage. And you can't say what he said then, even in the great state of Florida, and run as a Democrat for city council, right? So we collectively do believe different things than we did 20, 30 years ago in our lifetime, right? I don't know if you've been to New York recently, but it all smells like weed. And so it's like that didn't seem possible 10 years ago.
No, it sure did not. Nope.
How did we change that? And so their answer was in several of these studies that it was the arts, that it was the TV that you watch and the books that you read, and Ellen comes out and Queer Eye for the Straight Guy comes on TV, and Modern Family and Will and Grace. And next thing you know, my mother thinks she has more gay friends than she had 20 years ago, right? It's not true. It's just a different situation altogether in terms of what it feels like to come out. So that's in our lifetime. So our goal is to do the same thing for addiction, which is to change that national narrative. And I think part of that is, there's a lot of like really successful, fun, sober people. And I think just them coming out and talking about it, because I think they were there before, but you didn't hear about it, right? So one of the things I'm so grateful for, Hank Azaria, who I grew up like loving him on The Simpsons, came on as one of our co-producers on the show. And he wrote this beautiful op-ed in the New York Times about how he's sober and how Matthew Perry helped to save his life. And so I feel like what's so important about that is not just the idea that recovery is possible, but that like somebody really funny and really rich and really successful is a sober person and proud of it. Because I feel like that's the same thing as what the beer ads are telling you. And I think if we're all anonymous all the time, you don't realize who it is, and that like, oh no, people are having flourishing careers and phenomenal experiences and families and all those things. And you don't realize that recovery is a part of it.
Yeah. And I think sometimes too, we have such the narrative of you're a more creative artist when you drink and do drugs. And my husband's a painter. And so I'll hear, well, you go on LSD and boy, you'll have these great paintings. And what happens when you don't do those things? You won't be as creative.
Definitely in the theater world, I feel like it's so baked in. And, we always joke like nobody wants a sober Jack Kerouac and nobody wants a sober Hunter S. Thompson. Like that doesn't feel fun. And then, like Hemingway put a shotgun in his mouth and killed himself. But like he was a great writer before that. You know what I mean? Like, and you're like,
ignore that part.
Ignore that part. Like that it really ended.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like it's so baked into our culture in the arts that like it's what it costs you. Like that's just part of the deal you make with the devil, is that you have to give yourself over. And so not true. Terrence McNally is really one of my idols, and he is one of America's great playwrights. And, he talks very openly, or he did, he passed away recently, but about some of his greatest plays that, were written after he got sober. So like there are living proof of people who
look at that.
And you're like, well, no, because the attention to detail, there's so many things that you can't do when you're 20% numb all the time that I feel like actually holds you back as an artist.
Yeah. You mentioned, Sean, the Recovery Project. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the Recovery Project is using the arts to try to battle addiction. So we want to, first of all, figure out how we can work with the arts community to stop artists from overdosing, to stop artists from dying. And then how do we work within the arts community to be able to create narratives that are out there? How do we do the same thing for addiction that happened for gay marriage? And that's, everything from commissioning new plays about the subject to be able to celebrate artists who are in recovery. We also just put together for all performing arts organizations in the country just some like HR tools on like, what do you do? Because nobody knows what to do. Nobody's trained in this, right? We're launching a warm line. There's like a secret warm line for airline pilots and lawyers and nurses. If you're struggling, there's a place that you can get help and you can get peer-to-peer coaching. It doesn't exist for the arts. And so we're putting that together so that any art, every boss I know, and they think of themselves as a cool boss, is like, I tell my staff, if you want to come to me and tell me you're struggling, you can do it. But nobody ever goes to their boss and says like, by the way,
No.
I've been drunk at work for the last 2 weeks. Like you would only go get help if you knew that your career wouldn't be over the second that you did it, right? And so we want to do the same thing for artists, is have a safe place for them to be able to call and get some peer-to-peer counseling from someone that they don't work with but can walk them through what happens next.
Yeah.
And everybody should have recovery-friendly workplaces in place. But at the end of the day, it's terrifying to ask for help from the people that, are they going to judge you now the next time that you seem tired at work, or, you're off camera because of whatever happened, right? Suddenly you don't want that.
Right. Well, speaking of being off camera now, Kelly, what are you thinking as you listen to the wonderful Sean?
I think, one thing that really stuck out for me too is just the way that you kind of injected humor into it. I think it kind of creates a lighter approach for people who might feel like it's just this gargantuan thing that I can't do myself. And the reality is they can't. They need help. And that you provided a vehicle like the White Chip to create this opportunity for people to come to you and say, I think it's time that I need help. I mean, what a tremendous response. How did you feel when you started hearing that reaction?
The amazing thing that happened, and I don't know where they are now, but so at the very first preview, which is the first time that you ever do it in front of an audience, somebody came up to our lead actor, Joe Tapper, afterwards and said, I'm an alcoholic. And he said like, oh, great. Can I give you a hug? And she said, but I'm not sober right now. And he was like, okay, all right. And then 17 days later, got a message from that same person that said like, I have 17 days today. So that they had really used that moment as their, starting point towards trying to get healthy and get there. I'm so glad that people came to the show, and I'm so glad that they wanted to get help. But at the end of the day, I was like, why is the last thing that someone does before getting sober spending $50 on an off-Broadway ticket? Like I'm not sure that's what I would do. But, and what I realized in it is that the very first time I ever went to an AA meeting, I was terrified that as soon as I walked in, everybody there would know that I was an alcoholic, even though they were there for the exact same reason. I'm just like, I've admitted something by showing up. And so I think going to see a show, lots of people go see shows. You haven't admitted anything by doing it. You know what I mean? You can really just try to dip your toe in and see what it is. And then by the end of it, you feel like you're ready to take it on. And I think the other big thing that it's really driven home for me, and you think about this from like a scientific standpoint, whatever you think of AA or NA, like a lot of people go and a lot of people tell their stories to other people and it saves their life, right? Mm-hmm. And so why does that work? Like that, why does that work for anybody? That's not medicine or science or exercise or diet. And what I've really come to believe that the opposite of addiction is not abstinence, that it's community, that it's gathering with other people and being able to feel less alone in that moment and sharing that with them. I mean, that's the only reason why you'd meet with strangers in a church basement and then feel better afterwards, right? That's not about pills. That's not about anything. That's about the kind of human need to feel connected to other people. And so I think seeing a show is the same way, right? You're with however 100 other people and you laugh or don't laugh at the things that they laugh at, but you're in community and in conversation with them for at least 90 minutes.
Yeah. I mean, I literally got chills when you talked about the woman who called and said, I'm 17 days sober. I mean, that is the power of the work that you're doing. What are your plans for the White Chip now?
So it just closed in New York, but our goal is to just try to continue to find the largest platform for it, whether that's in New York or DC or London or online or wherever it is, but to try to keep that going because, by the end you couldn't get a ticket. And so that's great. But the kind of more important thing was that conversation was happening continually. So I don't think it's the end of the show.
I certainly hope not. What projects are next in terms of the recovery project? What's being commissioned?
Craig Lucas, who just did Days of Wine and Roses on Broadway, is going to be commissioned to be able to write a new piece for us. The Terrence McNally Foundation is putting together, they gave us a grant for Craig to be able to mentor somebody who's a young writer in recovery and be able to go forward. But the most things that are coming forward is really trying to figure out how do we take care of our own industry. We just finished up this HR video that is, I think, hilarious. And I've never seen a funny HR video before. It's a mix of like Henson puppeteers and phenomenal video editors and Jen Cody, who was a Disney princess, all working to try to make a fun video about like how can performing arts organizations create recovery-friendly workplaces. And so like we're just trying to also like make sure we're taking care of our own industry, so that they can be set up to have these conversations and to help other people. The thing that always gets, like, they're great storytellers, but not when it comes to this. The performing arts in our country is 4% of the gross domestic product. So it's like we're about the same size as the airline industry, right? So, except our doors stay on all the time. But we don't think about like that's a huge vehicle for a conversation and a huge place. I mean, if you're, even theaters down here have 40,000 people coming through their doors, 8 times a year. Like it really is community centers where great conversation could be happening, where change could be happening. And sometimes we're not taking advantage of that low-hanging fruit. One of the things we're doing with Live Tampa Bay is collecting 1-minute stories of recovery and then sharing them in the Tampa Bay area kind of based on super specific like zip codes where overdoses are the highest. We're like about halfway through collecting 200 1-minute stories of people in recovery so that we can then go share them online with people in our community.
That's incredible. It's such a powerful medium that you work in for people to see visually and hear the stories. And I can imagine the power of those 1-minute stories will be amazing.
Oh, I cry at all. I mean, it's
I'm
like,
sure.
Because people are, a lot of people talking about how they got their kids back and a lot of people talking about how they have 90 days or have 4 years or whatever. And so like, it's like such a victory for each of them. And this is what I love about them, right? Because they could say like, oh, I want to be anonymous. I don't want to talk about it. But they're all putting themselves out there in terms of sharing it so that you can see that people were formerly incarcerated or people were formerly unhoused and that they're in a much better place now than they were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as Carrie's mentioned, folks who have battled addiction are some of the most honest people you'll ever meet. And so those stories, I think, really resonate with folks who are struggling as you were prior to being sober.
Yeah. So part of what I think comedy is so important and national narratives is that if you've ever watched like a recovery meeting on TV, it's like 6 sad people in a church basement and they like chant your name at you. And so you're always like, I don't think I want to go to that. That doesn't sound exciting. And then when you really go to a great place, it's packed full of people. And yes, it's like a very dark sense of humor. And they tell these horror stories and the room like roars with laughter because it's the laughter of recognition of everybody that's been there before. And so laughter is such a huge part of it. And that's not reflected in pop culture when you see recovery. I like to joke, if there's ever someone who's in recovery in a TV show, I promise you they will relapse at the end of season 1. Like, they got super stressed and then there was a bottle in the corner. It only serves that narrative. And we've gotten so good about other narratives in our country, not just using tropes over and over again. And I feel like next up is for the recovery community to claim that people are sometimes just in recovery and that's part of who they are. And not everything is a rock bottom story.
The honesty and the passion in which you share your story and the mission of what you're accomplishing with the White Chip and, Live Tampa Bay is incredible. As a last question, Sean, you have 1 minute with someone who is stuck and wants to break out. What would you tell them?
It's so cheesy, but I was once told that like every storm runs out of rain. And I feel like that is like such great advice in terms of, when you're in an awful moment and you're like, I don't know how I'm going to get through this. And you're like, actually, every storm runs out of rain. It's like, oh, okay. All right. That's actually true. That at some point, like it's going to get better, which doesn't mean that it's not going to get worse again. But it just means that, that it always is possible. And that thing that gets said a lot in recovery circles is 2 things. One is more will be revealed. And I struggle with that because as an addict, I would like that to be now. But it really means that just in the future, you're going to know more than you do now. And you have to trust that is coming. And also the idea of one day at a time, that like really almost anything can be tackled if you're just trying to do what you need to do today. So I think for me, thinking one day at a time is how I break out of anything because that feels controllable and doable. It's actually all I can control, right? Whatever panic I have about the future, I can't do anything about. I can only handle what's happening today.
Mm-hmm. Oh, such wisdom. Thank you so much, Sean, for sharing your story. You're literally changing people's lives with the work that you're doing. And looking to reduce overdoses by 50% over 5 years is a tremendous victory, for sure, that you're working toward achieving. So thank you so much for being with us.
It was so amazing to listen to you. Thank you for all the work you're doing.
Oh my God. Thank you guys.
That was writer, producer, and addiction narrative box breaker, Sean Daniels. And this is The Breakout from Abrachi Group.
At Abrachi Group, we specialize in coaching and consulting for brave new directions. Connect with us at abrachigroup.com.
And don't forget to subscribe to The Breakout so you never miss a new episode. And make sure you're following us on Instagram at The Breakout Pod. I'm Kelly Gunther.
And I'm Dr. Carrie Ulrich. See you next time.